If you can play Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, I'll marry you on the spot. Morgan Pierce didn't even glance up from her phone when she said it, her heels striking the marble lobby of Orion Records like a gavel. The janitor froze mid-polish, crouched beside the grand piano, and looked at her with eyes that carried more stories than words ever could. She thought it was just a joke until she saw the way his hand lingered on the bench. Stay with me until the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels. The lobby of Orion Records was a cathedral of glass and steel, cold perfect, echoing every sound like it wanted to memorize it. Late at night, it felt like a place no one owned, not even the woman who ran it. Morgan Pierce strode in, phone in one hand, espresso in the other. She barely noticed the janitor kneeling beside the grand piano, his broad shoulders hunched as he polished its legs like he was tending to something sacred. The instrument gleamed under the pendant lights, a relic in a world that preferred streaming numbers to real music. Without looking up, she tossed out the words like they meant nothing. If you can play Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, I'll marry you on the spot. Her heels clicked toward the elevator, and for a moment there was only the soft swish of cloth against wood. Then she heard it, his voice low and steady. I heard you, he said. But that's not a piece you play because someone dares you. That made her stop. Slowly she turned. The janitor's eyes were an odd gray-green steady, but unreadable. He didn't move except to fold the cleaning cloth in his palm, each corner aligned with the precision of a soldier folding a flag. So you do know it, she said, eyebrow lifting. He didn't answer, just returned to polishing the quiet between them, stretching until it felt deliberate. Morgan let out a dry little laugh, the kind she used in boardrooms when someone underestimated her. Didn't think so. She didn't understand why she said it. Maybe it was the silence or the absurd romance of that piano gleaming in an empty lobby. Maybe it was the way he looked at the instrument not as office decor, but as if it remembered him. The elevator doors slid open and she stepped inside without looking back. Hours later, when the last badge swipe had cleared the building, Daniel Cross sat on the bench. His fingers hovered over the keys, not pressing, just resting like they were waiting for permission. He closed his eyes. No music came, only the kind of silence that had shape weight and memory. The next morning, Morgan was halfway through her coffee when she caught herself staring across the glass wall of her office at the piano in the lobby. A faint smudge barely there caught the light. She remembered the way his hand had rested there, the stillness in his eyes. Jennifer, she said, cutting her assistant off mid-sentence. Who's the overnight janitor, Daniel Cross? Started 6 months ago, third shift. Why Morgan didn't answer. She just glanced back at the piano and pretended it didn't matter. That night she worked late. The building had that rare kind of quiet you could feel in your bones. Drawn downstairs without knowing why she found him again, kneeling at the piano, polishing the brass pedals. I owe you an apology, she said, stepping closer. He didn't look up. For what? For being condescending. That Chopin comment. His hands slowed. Most people wouldn't remember. I remember everything she said softly. Daniel straightened, meeting her eyes. Then remember, this Chopin isn't a party trick. It's a prayer. Something in her chest tightened, though she didn't know why. She tilted her head. You speak like someone who's played him. I've played a lot of things, he replied. Doesn't mean I still do. Why not? He hesitated, cloth still in his hand. Because some things stop belonging to you when you stop needing them to survive. Morgan didn't know it yet, but those words were going to follow her for a very, very long time. Morgan told herself it was nothing, just a late-night conversation with a man who knew too much about Chopin to be scrubbing brass pedals for a living. But the words he'd left her with, some things stop belonging to you when you stop needing them to survive, slid under her skin and stayed there like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. 2 days later, she found herself in the lobby again, long after most of the building had gone dark. The security guard raised an eyebrow when she passed. Working late again, he asked. She muttered something about deadlines and kept walking, but the truth was, she wasn't sure why she was there. The piano sat in its usual place, gleaming under the pendant lights. She slowed her steps, scanning for him. No janitor cart, no steady rhythm of cloth over wood. The silence felt heavier without him in it. She lingered a moment, then went upstairs, annoyed at herself for caring. The following night, she stayed later than usual, not because she needed to finish contracts, but because the building's emptiness had started to feel expectant. Around midnight, she headed down to the lobby again, telling herself she was only passing through. This time, he was there. Daniel knelt on the marble floor, polishing the piano's legs with a small, deliberate movement, his head bent as if in prayer. She hesitated, then walked toward him. "You weren't here last night," she said. He looked up briefly. "Had to cover another floor." The conversation should have ended there, but instead she found herself asking, "How long have you been doing this janitorial work?" "Yes, about 8 years." He didn't sound ashamed. If anything, he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer explained himself. "That's a long time to be doing something you don't care about," she said. Daniel's mouth curved in something between a smile and a smirk. "You think you can tell what I care about? I think I can tell when someone's meant for more than this," she replied, her voice low, almost offensive. He set the cloth aside, leaned back on his heels, and studied her. "Maybe more looks different from where I'm standing." There was no challenge in his tone, no bitterness, just truth. It disarmed her in a way boardroom arguments never could. Morgan crossed her arms, unwilling to be the one to look away first. "I saw you leave something on the piano the other night," she said finally. A flicker passed over his face, gone as quickly as it came. "Did you 4 bars?" she said. "Handwritten." It stopped mid-phrase. "Most things do," he murmured. She stepped closer, tilting her head. "You wrote it, and if I did, then I want to hear the rest." He shook his head slowly. "It's not finished. Maybe it's waiting for someone to finish it with you," she offered. His eyes held hers for a moment like he was measuring the weight of her words. Then without answering, he picked up the cloth again and resumed his work as if the conversation had never happened. The next morning, she couldn't stop thinking about that half-written melody. She had meetings stacked back-to-back, a marketing crisis on the West Coast, and yet her mind kept drifting to a folded page of notes abandoned on a music stand. By early evening, she found herself pulling up old concert archives on her laptop. Names and dates scrolled past until one photo made her stop. It was grainy, taken from the back of a small concert hall. A young man sat at a grand piano posture, straight hands poised over the keys. The caption read, "E. Cross Finalist, St. George Classical Showcase, 2005. Considered a rising star. Disappeared from the circuit in 2009. Her coffee went cold. That night she waited until the building was empty before finding him in the break room rinsing out a rag. "You're not just a janitor," she said from the doorway. He didn't look up. "And you're not just a CEO. I spent 3 hours digging through concert archives," she continued. "You were supposed to be the next big thing, then you vanished." He dried his hands, slowly set the rag on the counter, and finally met her gaze. "You've done your homework. I don't like mysteries in my building," she said. "I'm not a mystery," he replied. "I'm just a man doing his job." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You're a man hiding, and I want to know why." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, as if deciding whether she could handle the truth. "You ever lose everything that made sense to you in one moment?" Morgan didn't answer. "You train your whole life to master something." He continued. "You breathe it, sleep it, bleed for it. Then one day it stops being enough, not because you're not good, but because life hands you a new sheet of music and says, 'Play this instead.'" "What was the moment?" she asked. His voice softened. "My wife. Cancer. She passed in the spring of 2009. Our daughter was 2. Morgan felt her throat tighten. "I couldn't tour with a toddler, couldn't teach master classes and still be there when she woke up coughing in the night. I had to choose." "And you chose her," she said quietly. Every time he replied. The silence that followed was not empty, it was weighted with something sacred. "I don't know if I'd be strong enough to do that," Morgan admitted. "You'd be surprised what you're capable of when someone small needs you to survive," he said. She studied him for a long moment. "So you gave it all up?" "I gave up the stage," he said, "not the music." "Where is it now?" His eyes flickered to her, then away. "Mostly quiet. Sometimes it wakes up when she laughs, or when she sleeps. But I don't play anymore." "Why not?" "Because when I sit at the keys, now," he said, "I hear everything I've lost." Morgan stepped closer, her voice steady. You're wrong. You don't hear what you've lost. You hear who you've loved. That's not the same thing. For the first time, something in his expression shifted, not enough to call it a smile, but enough to suggest the ice had cracked. Neither of them noticed how long they stood there in the quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound between them, until Morgan finally said, "Play it for someone who doesn't know who you are." Maybe that's what we're both missing. Daniel didn't answer, but his eyes held hers in a way that told her he'd heard every word. Morgan couldn't explain why she kept thinking about his words. They had a way of following her, slipping between her thoughts during meetings, echoing when she was alone in the elevator, rising up at night when the city was quiet. You hear who you've loved. It was dangerous how that line could make her feel something she wasn't ready to name. A week passed before the next collision between them. She'd been buried in prep for the upcoming Orion Records Gala, a night of champagne schmoozing and a high-profile performance from a Berlin Philharmonic pianist. The event was meant to be flawless. Then 3 hours before the curtain rose, her phone rang. The pianist had been in a car accident, minor injuries but enough to send him to the hospital. Her event team scrambled for a replacement, calling every agent they knew. The best they could manage on such short notice was a local performer who couldn't arrive until midway through the evening. The board members were already panicking when someone joked, "Didn't you used to play, Morgan? Just do the opening piece yourself." They expected her to laugh it off. Instead, she smiled tightly and said, "I'll handle it." Now standing backstage with the Steinway under a halo of light, she realized just how reckless that had been. She hadn't touched a piano in 18 years. 4 hours in a practice room earlier that afternoon had done nothing but remind her how stiff her fingers felt, how uneven her tempo was. But pride is a stubborn thing. It will let you burn rather than bow. She made it through the piece barely. The applause was polite but not warm. She could feel the confusion ripple through the room. Why is she up there? Is she all right? By the time she left the stage, her hands were trembling. She didn't want anyone's pity, so she slipped out a side exit, letting the cold night air cut through her gown like a blade. The staff parking lot was mostly empty, the only sounds the hum of idling vans and the faint thump of music from inside. Then she heard something else, soft, deliberate, fragile as moonlight on water. A piano. The same piece she had just played, but now it breathed. Each note was a heartbeat. Each pause was its own kind of prayer. She followed it to a dimly lit storage bay behind the loading dock. A battered upright piano sat there, clearly dragged out from some corner of the building for decoration and forgotten. Daniel was at the bench, eyes half-closed posture, straight fingers moving with an ease she hadn't seen in anyone for years. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He knew she was there. She could tell by the way his shoulders changed the slight lift of his head before the final chord faded into the shadows. "I thought you left," he said quietly. "I did," she replied. "Then you played." He rose slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. "Bach." She nodded. "My choice tonight." "You rushed the transitions in the middle," he said matter-of-factly. "Your hands got stiff, too much tension in the shoulders. You were listening, you were shouting, Morgan, not playing." The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She stepped closer. "How did you know the piece I played at once?" he said, after a pause. "For someone who mattered a long time ago." "You're not just a janitor, are you?" she asked softly. "No more than you're just a CEO. We all hide in uniforms." There was something in the way he said it that made her stop breathing for a second. She wanted to ask him why he'd given it up, why he was here instead of in a concert hall. But she already knew. He had told her before life had handed him a different score. "Why are you here?" she asked instead. "Why spend your nights cleaning floors, polishing pianos, hiding backstage?" "Because life is a thief," he said without looking at her. "It takes what you love and leaves you with what you need to survive. And sometimes survival looks like pushing a mop." Her throat tightened. "That's a poetic way of saying you gave up." He turned to her, then his gaze steady. "I didn't give up. I gave everything." There's a difference. She saw it clearly now, the man who could play but had chosen not to. Not because he'd lost his gift, but because someone had mattered more. The thought lodged itself deep in her chest. You should have been on that stage tonight, she said. It wasn't my place, he replied. Then where is your place, she asked, taking a step closer. He hesitated, something flickering behind his eyes. Grief, maybe, or something older. My place is beside the person who needs me most. She didn't know what to say to that. For a moment, they just stood there, the dim light casting their shadows across the battered piano. She thought of all the prodigies her label had signed, all the gifted performers who chased fame like oxygen. And here was a man who had played something she couldn't forget, and then walked away like it was nothing, or maybe like it was everything. That night she couldn't sleep. Her penthouse felt too large, too silent. She found herself searching through old databases, concert programs, anything that might connect Daniel Cross to the music world she once knew. Aside from that single photo and a few brief mentions, it was as though he had vanished without a trace. The next evening, long after most of the office had gone home, she returned to the lobby. The piano sat untouched under the low lights. She lowered herself onto the bench, letting her hands hover above the keys. The first notes came out halting, fragile. She stumbled over rhythms, stopped twice, then started again. She was halfway through when another set of hands joined hers, not intruding, just filling in where she faltered. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. They played together, weaving a melody from half-remembered scales and uncertain harmonies. It was imperfect, raw, and somehow beautiful. When they finally stopped, she realized her chest felt lighter. Your left hand still tenses when you're uncertain, he said quietly. So does my heart, she replied. The two are usually connected. She turned to face him. What was that piece we just played? I don't know, he said. We made it up. Morgan smiled an unpracticed, unguarded smile she hadn't felt in years. Maybe we should finish it someday. Daniel's eyes softened. Maybe we already started. Morgan didn't plan to see him outside the building. She told herself their strange, wordless duet at the piano was just a moment, one that would fade like everything else in her overscheduled life. But 3 nights later, she was sitting across from Daniel Cross in a corner booth of a small diner 2 blocks from Orion Records, her blazer draped over the back of her chair, a plate of untouched fries between them. It had started as an accident. She'd stayed late again, reviewing contracts until the cleaning crew rolled in. Lily, his daughter, had been waiting near the lobby, coloring quietly while Daniel finished his shift. Morgan had never seen her before, brown curls escaping a loose braid knees swinging from the bench as she hummed to herself. When Daniel came back to get her, Lily had looked up and said, "Are you coming to dinner with us?" so matter-of-factly that Morgan almost laughed. "I don't," she began, but Lily had already slipped her small hand into hers and pulled her toward the door. And somehow Daniel hadn't stopped her. Now the 3 of them sat in a booth with mismatched cushions, Lily working her way through a grilled cheese while Daniel sipped black coffee. He wasn't a man who filled silences unnecessarily, but this one felt different. "She's got your eyes," Morgan said quietly. Daniel glanced at Lily, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "She's got her mother's stubbornness." Lily looked up at them, sensing she was part of the conversation, but not quite catching the meaning. "I'm not stubborn. I'm determined." Daniel chuckled, and Morgan felt the sound settle into her chest in a way she hadn't expected. After dinner, Lily insisted she wanted to show Morgan something important. Daniel didn't argue, just led them through narrow streets until they stopped in front of a modest apartment building. Inside the hallway smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. The apartment itself was small but warm, the kind of place where nothing was expensive, but everything had a purpose. The upright piano sat beneath the living room window, sunlight pooling over its worn keys. Framed sheet music lined the wall above it, and a second-hand bookshelf sagged under the weight of classical scores and children's books. Lily ran ahead, pulling a thick folder from the shelf and carrying it to the couch. "These are Daddy's songs," she announced proudly. "Well, most of them. He says the rest are sleeping." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Sleeping?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Unfinished ideas, melodies I never chased down." She took the folder, gently flipping to the first page. Notes spiraled across the staff like a thought half-formed, ending abruptly mid-phrase. "You wrote this a lifetime ago," he said. "It's beautiful," she murmured, tracing the final measure with her fingertip. "But it stops too soon." "So did a lot of things," he replied, his voice softer now. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt charged, like the air between them had grown heavier without either of them moving. Lily climbed onto the bench and pressed one of the low keys, letting the note hum through the room. "That's my favorite one," she said. "When I was little, Daddy played at night when he thought I was asleep. I always listened." Morgan glanced at Daniel. His jaw was tight, but he didn't look away. "You play too?" she asked Lily. The girl grinned. "I try. My fingers are short." "They'll grow," Daniel said, adjusting her hand gently on the keys. "And they already know more than most people's hearts." Morgan sat beside them, watching as Lily stumbled through a simple arpeggio. Daniel didn't correct every mistake, only enough to guide her forward. His patience was something she wasn't used to seeing in a world that demanded perfection. When Lily was tucked into bed an hour later, Morgan found herself back at the piano. The unfinished score lay open in front of her, the pencil marks faint but still visible. Daniel sat beside her, the lamplight catching the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes. "Why this one?" she asked quietly. "Why not finish it?" He was silent for a long time. "Because I wrote it for someone I never got to say goodbye to." Finishing it felt final, like she'd really be gone. Morgan didn't ask who he meant. She didn't need to. Instead, she placed her hand on the keys, tentative but steady. Some songs aren't meant to be endings. They're meant to be open doors. He looked at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "You think I should finish it?" "No," she said softly. "I think we should." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, like an unspoken agreement, their hands found the keys. They began to fill in the blank bars, testing variations, layering sound upon sound, not perfectly, but truthfully. It wasn't about skill anymore. It was about presence. At one point, Daniel stopped. "You modulated early." "I know," she said with a small smile. "It felt right. You're breaking the rules." "Rules didn't raise a child alone," she replied. "Rules didn't hold you together when your world fell apart." He looked at her for a long moment, and then his lips curved into the smallest smile. "No, but music did." The clock struck midnight before either of them noticed. Daniel leaned back, stretching. "Lily's got an early appointment tomorrow." Morgan rose, lingering at the doorway. "Thank you for letting me see this part of your life." He walked her to the door but didn't open it right away. She turned, meeting his gaze. "I've been thinking about what you said about survival and sacrifice. I realized something." "What's that?" "You didn't just give something up," she said. "You gave yourself away piece by piece to build something bigger than you." He didn't speak for a moment. Then quietly, "Maybe it's time." She stepped into the hallway, the air cooler than it had been inside. "Good night, Mr. Cross." He smiled faintly. "Good night, Miss Pierce." The door closed between them, but the echo of the melody they'd begun still hummed in her head, soft and insistent, like it wasn't finished with either of them yet. Morgan had told herself she would let a few days pass before seeing him again, but life had other plans. It came in the form of a shaky phone video sent to her by a junior marketing assistant with the subject line, "You need to see this." She opened it, expecting some internal PR mishap, maybe a leaked artist contract. Instead, she saw herself sitting at the Orion lobby piano under low pendant lights, her hands drifting across the keys, Daniel beside her weaving in a quiet harmony. No words, no audience, just music. The caption read, "When the janitor plays a duet with the CEO and the piano remembers." The clip was only 38 seconds long, shot through the glass wall of the security booth. But the intimacy was undeniable. She could almost feel the stillness in the room, the way their eyes had met for just a moment before they returned to the keys. Her phone buzzed again. Jennifer, her assistant. It's circulating through internal Slack threads, social media. "Even Reddit has a thread about it," she said, her voice low and cautious. Morgan forced her tone to stay even. "How many views?" "Over 200,000 from private shares alone. The algorithm picked it up this morning." And the comments, Jennifer hesitated. Some supportive, most speculative. Office gossip, power dynamics. "You know how these things go." Morgan set the phone down, the weight of it pressing into her palm. "Does the board know they've called 6 times?" Richard left a message asking for a frank conversation tonight. By the time she found Daniel, the video had already reached him. He was in the staff stairwell, wiping down handrails with practiced precision. He didn't look up when she walked in. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said. She held up her phone. "It's everywhere." "I know, you knew someone recorded us. I found out this morning. Someone in payroll winked at me and said, 'Nice duet, maestro.' I thought he was joking." "This isn't funny, Daniel," she said sharply. "No, it's not." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "They're turning this into something it's not. Turning you into something you're not. They're saying you're using me. Or that I'm manipulating you. That you're some PR project I took on to fix my public image." He finally met her eyes. "And what do you think it is?" "I think—" She faltered, her throat tightening. "I think it's real. Whatever this is, it's the most honest thing I've touched in years." His gaze held hers, searching for something. "Then why do you look like you're already running from it?" "Because I know how this ends," she admitted. "Tell me." "They'll drag my name through the mud, question my judgment, my leadership, everything I've built." "You think I don't know how that feels?" He said, his voice sharpening. "I gave up the only thing I was ever praised for. I vanished so my daughter could breathe. You think I don't know what it means to watch your life dissolve?" She looked away. "I didn't ask for this." "No," he said quietly, "but you played for it. You showed up for it, and now you want to hide. I'm trying to protect you." "No," he replied. "You're trying to protect your image, and you're using me as the reason to retreat." The words landed like a slap. He didn't flinch. "When was the last time you stayed in something messy?" "Morgan," he asked. "Something you couldn't script, couldn't schedule, couldn't control." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "That's what I thought he said." She wrapped her arms around herself like armor. "You have no idea the pressure I'm under." "You're right," he said. "I just know what it feels like to be left standing when someone walks away." Her voice was quieter now. "Is that what you think I'll do?" "I don't think it," he said. "I see it." The next morning, the trade headlines hit Power Ballad, or Power Imbalance. Orion Records CEO Morgan Pierce caught an intimate moment with Janitor. Inside headquarters, whispers followed her down every hallway. She didn't need to hear the words to know their shape. By 4 o'clock, she was in the boardroom 20 minutes early for the meeting she knew would decide everything. The faces around the table were familiar, but their expressions had hardened into polite masks. Richard Quinn, her uncle and the board's chairman, entered last. "We need to address the optics," he said without preamble. "We'll issue a statement clarifying your relationship with Mr. Cross as non-romantic and outline our zero-tolerance policy moving forward." She met his gaze. "It is romantic." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. "I'm not going to lie to make you comfortable," she continued. "I sat at that piano because I felt something real. I'm not ashamed of it." "This could cost the company millions," Richard warned. "Then maybe we should ask why we've built something so fragile that a single moment of humanity can shake it." "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," she said quietly. "For once, I'm choosing something else." That night, she walked out of the building alone. No entourage, no press statement, just her in the city air. Her phone buzzed a message from Daniel. "We lost something today, didn't we? Or maybe we finally stopped pretending we never had it." Her reply came before she could second-guess it. "I don't want to lose you." His response was instant. "Then don't." But when she knocked on his apartment door the next evening, there was no answer. A neighbor poked her head out, curious. "He left a few hours ago. Said something about the hospital." Morgan didn't wait for details. For the first time in years, the woman who had built an empire ran. The hospital's fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual, buzzing faintly overhead as Morgan pushed through the double doors of the pediatric wing. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something else, fear maybe, or the way time itself seemed to hold its breath in places like this. Room 312's door was cracked. She paused, hearing nothing but the steady beep of a heart monitor, then eased it open. Daniel was seated beside the bed, his hand wrapped protectively around a much smaller one. Lily lay pale and still against the white sheets, her chest rising with shallow effort. Thin tubes framed her face, and a stuffed bear rested under her arm. Daniel's other hand covered his eyes. his shoulders tight with the kind of tension that didn't come from hours. It came from years. "Daniel," she said softly. He looked up. His face was hollowed, his voice almost unrecognizable. "How did you know I was here?" "Your neighbor," she replied. "You didn't answer my text." "Sorry," he murmured. His gaze fell back to Lily. Morgan stepped closer, her throat tightening at the sight of the little girl. "How is she critical?" he whispered. The attack hit harder than usual. Her oxygen dropped so fast they had to intubate before I could even process what was happening. "Is she awake?" She was. She kept asking for the song, the one we were writing together. His voice cracked. "I promised I'd finish it for her, but I... He swallowed hard. "I couldn't." Morgan reached for his hand, her own fingers cold. "Then we'll finish it now." He looked at her, tears threatening but refusing to fall. "You think she'll hear us?" "I think love travels," she said, "even through glass and wires and beeping machines, especially then." They sat side by side, no piano between them, just Lily's blanket beneath their hands. They tapped the rhythm softly into the fabric, humming the melody they'd been building together, Daniel's low harmony weaving around her softer thread. The hospital seemed to fade until there was nothing left but the two of them and the little girl lying between them. Halfway through, Daniel's voice, rusty from years of silence, began to sing. The sound was rough, but it carried a truth that made Morgan's eyes sting. She joined him without thinking, their voices finding each other in the small, sterile room. When they finished, there was no applause, no audience, just the faintest twitch of Lily's fingers against Daniel's palm. She heard as Morgan whispered, her lips trembling into a smile. A few hours later, a doctor came in, expression measured but kind. "Her vitals are stabilizing. The medication is helping, but this isn't sustainable long term. She'll need more advanced treatment." "Likely out of state." Daniel straightened. "How long do we have?" "A few weeks, maybe less, if another episode hits before her system recovers. You should prepare." When the door closed, the silence that followed felt heavier than any words could fill. Daniel leaned against the wall, his voice low and raw. "I can't afford Boston. I can't even afford a second ER visit." Morgan stepped forward. "Then let me help." "I can't ask you for that." "You didn't ask," she said. "I'm offering." His eyes searched hers, pain flickering in every line of his face. "Do you know what it feels like to have your dignity measured in invoices?" She reached up her hand, brushing his cheek. "Do you know what it feels like to have money and still feel useless?" That stopped him. "I've sat in boardrooms making million-dollar decisions while my soul begged for something real." She continued softly. "Don't rob me of the chance to finally give something that matters." He didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled her into an embrace, fierce, silent, uncalculated. Not romantic in that moment, just human. Two people holding each other at the edges of fear. The next day, Morgan cleared her schedule without hesitation. She called every contact she had in pediatric cardiology, leaned on old favors, and donated anonymously to the hospital foundation to fast-track Lily's transfer. But she didn't just sign checks. She sat with Lily, told her stories about women who wore crowns and fought dragons, read her music notes like fairy tales, and brought coloring books and noise-canceling headphones so the constant beeping wouldn't wear her down. Slowly, the room began to smell less like fear and more like crayons paper, and the faint trace of cinnamon from the tea Daniel always brewed in the corner. 3 days later, the call came. Lily was approved for transport to Boston Cardiac Center. The specialist team would take her within the week. That evening, Morgan returned to Orion Records for the last time. The board had already made their decision. They called it a mutually agreed transition. She called it the price of honesty. Her office, once a fortress of ambition, felt strangely hollow as she packed a single box, some framed photos, a worn leather notebook, and tucked under her arm Daniel's old composition folder. Jennifer appeared in the doorway holding a manila envelope. "These came in the mail today." Morgan frowned. "What is it, fan letters?" "From people who saw the video." She hesitated before opening the envelope. The letters were handwritten, some typed, some scribbled on scraps of paper. They didn't mock. They didn't speculate. They spoke about how the music had made them feel again, about memories of parents long gone, about holding on to something fragile and worth loving. Morgan smiled faintly. "Then maybe I finally did something worth the noise." She left the building without fanfare, without a speech. Just a woman with a box in one hand and someone else's unfinished song in the other. The next time she saw Daniel, they were standing outside the ambulance that would take Lily to Boston. Lily looked small in her coat, but her smile was steady, her eyes bright. "Miss Morgan," she said, tugging on her sleeve, "will you come visit me after I get my new heart?" Morgan knelt, looking her in the eye. "I'll be there the day it starts to beat." Lily leaned closer, whispering, "Bring the music." Daniel stood a few feet away watching the exchange. His eyes were misted, but his posture was proud. "Thank you," he said quietly when Morgan joined him. "You're welcome," she replied. "But I didn't save her. You did. Every day. You showed up when it was hard. That's what love looks like." He looked at her for a long moment. "You saved me." They stood there together until the ambulance doors closed, the sirens staying mercifully silent as the vehicle pulled away. Neither of them moved for a while, the hum of the street fading into something else entirely, an unspoken melody that neither wanted to see end. The ambulance was gone, swallowed by the city's gray streets, but Morgan stayed rooted to the spot long after it disappeared. Daniel hadn't moved either, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The air between them was heavy, but not empty like the pause between two movements of a song. She wanted to say something to promise him everything would be all right, but she had spent enough of her life dressing fear in false certainty. Instead, she simply asked, "Where will you be staying in Boston?" "A small place near the hospital," he said. "Short-term rental." "Just a bed, a kitchenette." "It's all I need, all you need," she echoed, though she knew he didn't mean it. They walked together in silence, their steps falling into an unplanned rhythm. By the time they reached the corner, the winter wind had found its way between them, but neither seemed in a hurry to part. In the days that followed, Morgan kept in touch with him more than she expected. She sent him updates from her contacts at the hospital, arranged for the first month's rent on his Boston apartment without telling him, and even had groceries delivered to the address he gave her just in case you forget to eat. He protested, of course, but she brushed it off every time. One evening, as the week drew to a close, she stopped by his apartment to drop off Lily's forgotten sketchbook. The hallway smelled faintly of cinnamon again, and she could hear the low hum of a kettle from inside. When he opened the door, there was something softer in his expression than she'd seen before. Not relief exactly, but a quiet gratitude that made her chest tighten. "You didn't have to come all the way here for that," he said, taking the sketchbook from her hand. "I wanted to," she replied. Lily appeared from the living room wearing a sweatshirt that looked 2 sizes too big a smile lighting her face despite the fatigue lingering in her eyes. "You came back," she exclaimed, wrapping her arms around Morgan's waist. Morgan laughed and hugged her back. "Of course I did. You have to show me the song title you picked." Lily dashed off to fetch a folded piece of paper, then returned with the kind of seriousness only a child could manage. She opened it to reveal bold, colorful letters, "The Song That Never Sleeps." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Her naming skills are dramatic." "No," Morgan said, smiling. "She understands something most composers forget, that real music doesn't end when the notes stop." They gathered around the piano again, this time in daylight. Lily climbed onto the bench, her posture surprisingly poised, fingers resting lightly on the keys. Daniel adjusted her wrist with the care of a craftsman, his voice low as he asked, "Ready?" She nodded and began, her left hand carrying a rhythm slightly off the expected pattern. Morgan tilted her head. "You hear that? She's playing in 3s, not 4s. Lily gave a small shrug. "It's just there if you listen with your eyes closed." Daniel grinned. "She's got what the teachers used to call an absolute ear, knows when a note is even a quarter tone sharp." Morgan crossed her arms, watching the little girl work through a broken arpeggio like she was unlocking a map only she could see. "You didn't tell me she was gifted." "She's not a trophy," Daniel said. "She's just Lily." Morgan met his eyes. "That's the most beautiful thing a parent can say." After practice, Lily curled up on the couch with a sketchpad drawing pianos with wings and music notes shaped like hearts. One of the figures was a woman with flowing red hair wearing a crown. Across the top in large letters it read, "Queen Morgan." Morgan laughed when she saw it. "I've never been royalty before." "You wear high heels like a queen," Lily said simply. Daniel came in with 2 mugs of tea, setting them down with a quiet smile. "She only calls people queen when they make her feel safe." Morgan blinked. That's a high compliment. She doesn't say it often, he said. His voice was even, but there was a shadow behind it. Lily looked up from her drawing. I used to call Mommy that too. The room went still, not awkward, but reverent. Morgan sat beside her and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She sounds like someone who left a lot of love behind. She did, Daniel said from the doorway. His voice wasn't broken, but there was an ache in it softened only by time. Later, when Lily went to her room for a nap, Morgan wandered to the bookshelf. Her fingers traced worn bindings, old concert programs, photographs of park days and birthday cakes. One book caught her attention, a faded journal with a red ribbon marking the middle. She opened it to find pages of music, but also words. Lyrics raw and unpolished, with notes scribbled in the margins. A single phrase repeated again and again in different corners of the pages. What we lose becomes what we love deeper. You wrote lyrics too, she said, turning toward him. Daniel, standing by the kitchen counter, nodded without looking up. You should finish these, she urged. I wrote them when Sarah was in the hospital, he said, his voice low. I couldn't fix her body, but I tried to give her a lullaby strong enough to stay behind. Morgan's throat tightened. Did you ever sing it to Lily once? She cried. Said it sounded like goodbye. Morgan closed the journal gently. Maybe now it could sound like home instead. He didn't answer right away. The kettle whistled softly, steam curling into the air between them. Finally, he said, She's getting worse. More attacks lately. Shorter breath. Her color fades faster. The doctors are talking about options, but I can't afford them. Morgan didn't reach for her checkbook. She didn't launch into solutions. She stepped closer and said, Then let me sit with you in the middle of that fear. You shouldn't have to carry this alone. He looked at her like he didn't quite know what to do with the words. I'm not used to people standing still when things get hard. Then I'll be the first, she whispered. When she finally left that night, Lily stirred from her nap just enough to whisper, Will you play that half-finished song again tomorrow? The one Daddy started. Morgan smiled. Of course. As she closed the apartment door behind her, the echo of those words stayed with her. Not because of the music, but because of what Lily had said before slipping back into sleep, something Morgan didn't share with Daniel yet. I think that song is helping Daddy come back to life. The next morning, Morgan woke before sunrise, the city outside her window still wrapped in the gray hush of early winter. She tried to push thoughts of Daniel and Lily aside, but they clung to her like a stubborn refrain. The way Lily had leaned against her during the piano lesson, the way Daniel's eyes softened when his daughter played it, was as if she'd been given a glimpse into a world where everything was smaller, but somehow infinitely more important. By noon, she was back at Orion Records, though she had no real reason to be. Her office felt like a ghost of the life she'd been living, the polished desk and framed awards suddenly meaningless in a way she hadn't expected. She sat there for nearly an hour before deciding she couldn't stay in that space any longer. When she arrived at Daniel's apartment later that afternoon, the hallway was too quiet. She knocked twice. No answer. Just as she was about to leave, the neighbor from before peeked her head out. They went to the hospital, she said. Something about Lily's breathing. Morgan didn't even thank her before she was already moving. At the hospital, she found them in the pediatric wing again, room 312. Daniel sat slouched in a chair, elbows on his knees, his face in his hands. Lily was propped up in bed, pale and small, her breaths coming in shallow pulls. What happened? Morgan asked, her voice low as she stepped inside. Daniel lifted his head, exhaustion etched deep into his features. She had another attack. This one came on fast. They've stabilized her for now, but he trailed off, shaking his head. Morgan crossed to the bed, taking Lily's hand gently. Hey, sweetheart, you scared us. Lily gave the faintest smile. I want the song, she whispered. Daniel's throat worked, but no sound came out. I can't, he began, but Morgan cut him off softly. Yes, we can. They moved to either side of the bed, tapping the melody out on the blanket just as they had before. Morgan began to hum the first line, Daniel, joining a beat. Later, their voices blending into something that felt less like music and more like a lifeline. Lily's eyes fluttered shut, her breathing evening out with each note. When they finished, the room was silent except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Daniel stared at his daughter like she was something both fragile and indestructible at the same time. A doctor entered, glancing between them. "She's stable for now. But we can't keep doing this in cycles. She needs surgery and she needs it soon. There's a facility in Boston, the best pediatric cardiac team in the country. I'll make the referral, but there are costs. Logistics." "We'll make it work," Morgan said before Daniel could speak. Outside in the hallway, Daniel turned to her, his voice rough. "Don't do this. Don't take on something you don't have to." "I want to," she said simply. "You know what it's like," he said, "to have your dignity measured in invoices?" "Yes," she answered, "and I know what it's like to have money and still feel useless. Don't take this from me." Something in his shoulders eased, but his eyes were still guarded. "Why? Why are you doing this? Because you've spent years showing up for her when it was hard. Let me show up for you now." That night she made calls until her voice was hoarse. By the end of the next day, the Boston transfer was approved. 3 mornings later, the ambulance waited at the curb outside Daniel's building. Lily wore a knit hat that slipped over her eyes, and she kept adjusting it with a stubborn determination that made Morgan smile. "You ready for your big trip?" Morgan asked. Lily grinned faintly. "Will you come visit me after I get my new heart? I'll be there the day it starts to beat." Morgan promised. Before they loaded her into the ambulance, Lily leaned close. "Bring the music." Morgan stood beside Daniel as the doors closed, neither speaking until the sirens faded into the distance. The street felt strangely still, the winter air pressing in around them. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice almost too low to hear. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "You've done the hard part every day, loving her even when it's hard." He looked at her for a long time, something unspoken passing between them. "You saved me," he said quietly. They stayed there until the cold started to bite through their coats. When they finally turned to go, they walked without hurry, side by side, as if neither wanted to be the first to let the other slip away. That night in her own apartment, Morgan sat at the piano she hadn't touched in over a decade. She opened Daniel's composition folder to the unfinished piece they'd worked on together. The notes stared back at her like an open question. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play slowly at first, then with more certainty, hearing not just the music but the echo of a child's voice saying, "I think that song is helping Daddy come back to life." When the final chord faded, she stayed there, hands resting on the keys, realizing that maybe it wasn't just helping him. Maybe it was bringing her back too. Boston in January had a way of swallowing sound. Snow softened the streets. The traffic moved slower, and the hospital sat like a beacon in the gray, its tall glass windows catching what little light the day had to offer. Morgan had flown in early that morning, landing before sunrise, so she could be there when Lily arrived. The ambulance pulled up just after 9. Morgan stood by the curb, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The back door swung open, and Daniel stepped down first, bundled in his old coat, his eyes scanning until they landed on her. "You didn't have to come this soon," he said, though his voice carried the faintest note of relief. "I told her I'd be here the day she got her new heart," Morgan replied. "I keep my promises." Lily was next, her knit hat pulled low over her forehead, the same one she'd worn when she left New York. Her smile broke through the cold as soon as she saw Morgan. "You made it." "Of course I did," Morgan said, leaning down so they were eye level. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" Inside the hospital, air was warm and too clean, the faint smell of disinfectant clinging to everything. They followed a nurse through winding hallways to a private pediatric room. Morgan set Lily's sketchbook on the bedside table before she even took off her coat. "I brought the music," she said. Lily's eyes lit up. "Good. We have to finish it before the surgery." Morgan glanced at Daniel, but he was already pulling the composition folder from his bag. He laid it open on the small hospital desk, smoothing the creased pages with hands that trembled only slightly. For the next hour, the three of them worked through the melody in hushed voices, Lily tapping rhythms on the blanket while Daniel and Morgan debated soft phrases versus sharp ones. Every so often, Daniel would stop mid-thought to glance at the monitor above Lily's bed, and Morgan would catch the flicker of worry he tried to hide. When a nurse came in to check Lily's vitals, Daniel stepped into the hallway. Morgan followed, leaning against the wall beside him. "She's stronger than she looks," Morgan said quietly. I know, he replied. But she's tired, Morgan. More tired than she lets on. Morgan's instinct was to reach for his hand, but she didn't. Not yet. Then we make sure she knows she doesn't have to carry this alone. He gave her a long look, something unspoken in his eyes. You've already done more than I could have asked for. That's the point, she said simply. The next few days passed in a blur of tests, consultations, and waiting. Morgan stayed in a small hotel 2 blocks from the hospital, though she spent more time in Lily's room than she did in her own bed. She brought coloring supplies, puzzles, and once even convinced the head nurse to let her roll a portable keyboard into the room so they could keep working on the song. One night after Lily had finally fallen asleep, Daniel and Morgan found themselves alone at the small table in the corner. The only light came from the hallway spilling through the cracked door. You know, he said after a long silence, when I stopped playing, I thought I was protecting her, protecting myself. But now I'm starting to think I was just hiding. Morgan's voice was steady but soft. Maybe you were, but maybe it was the only way you knew how to survive back then. He shook his head slightly. And what are you hiding from? She looked down at her hands. I thought if I just kept moving, building, fixing, winning, I could outrun the parts of me that were afraid to be seen. But then you and Lily, you didn't let me hide. They sat in that quiet for a while, neither needing to fill it. The following morning, Morgan walked into the hospital cafeteria to find Daniel hunched over a paper cup of coffee staring at his phone. She slid into the seat across from him. What is it? She asked. You're bored, he said without looking up. They're making statements, spinning the story. Morgan didn't even flinch. Let them. You're losing everything you built, he said, and this time there was no accusation in his tone, only worry. She met his eyes. Then maybe it wasn't worth what it cost me to keep it. He studied her for a long moment before nodding once. You've changed. Maybe I just remembered who I was before I started counting wins instead of moments. That evening, Morgan arrived at Lily's room to find the girl sketching intently, her tongue poking out in concentration. She held up the paper proudly when Morgan walked in. It's us, Lily explained. On stage. Daddy's playing and you're singing, and I'm the conductor. Morgan laughed, but there was a lump in her throat. I like the sound of that. Lily's surgery was set for the following morning. The night before, Morgan stayed later than usual. Daniel sat in the chair beside the bed, half asleep, his hand wrapped around his daughter's. Morgan stood at the foot of the bed, watching them both, the low hum of the machines filling the silence. When Daniel opened his eyes, she spoke quietly, so as not to wake Lily. I don't know what happens after tomorrow, but I'm not going anywhere. He gave her a look that was part exhaustion, part gratitude, part something neither of them could name. I believe you, he said. For the first time, she realized she wanted him to. The room was dim, the only light the faint blue glow from the monitor. Morgan sat down in the second chair close enough for her knee to brush his. They didn't talk after that. They didn't need to. The weight of the moment was its own language, one they both understood. The hospital woke before the sun did. In the pre-dawn stillness, the corridors hummed with a quiet urgency, nurses moving briskly, the scent of sterilized air sharper than usual, the muted squeak of rubber soles on polished tile. Morgan arrived at Lily's room just as the first light brushed across the glass. Daniel was already there, still in yesterday's clothes, his hair slightly mussed. He looked like he hadn't slept, but there was a steadiness in his posture that hadn't been there the night before. Lily was sitting up in bed, small hands fidgeting with the cuff of her sleeve. When she saw Morgan, her smile was faint but immediate. You came before breakfast, she said. I wasn't about to let you start the biggest day of your life without me, Morgan replied, moving closer to the bed. Daniel glanced at her with quiet gratitude, though he didn't say anything. A nurse entered with a clipboard explaining the pre-op steps in a soft, measured voice. Morgan listened, but her focus kept drifting back to Lily's face, those curious eyes that held both excitement and a fear too grown up for her years. When the nurse stepped out, Morgan crouched down so she was eye level with her. You ready? Lily tilted her head. Do you think they'll let me hear music while I'm asleep? Morgan smiled. If they don't, we'll make sure the first thing you hear when you wake up is your song. That seemed to settle her, at least for the moment. A few minutes later, orderlies came to wheel Lily toward the surgical wing. Daniel walked on one side of the bed, Morgan on the other. Neither spoke during the ride down the hall, the air between them thick with the weight of what was about to happen. At the double doors, they had to stop. Daniel leaned down, kissing his daughter's forehead. "I'll be here when you wake up, Peanut." Morgan took Lily's hand one last time. "And I'll be here too." The doors swung closed, leaving them in the quiet hallway. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Daniel exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging. "And now we wait," he said, almost to himself. They found seats in the surgical waiting area, a large windowless room that smelled faintly of stale coffee. The hours stretched, each one heavier than the last. Daniel paced at intervals, his boots whispering against the tile. Morgan alternated between watching the clock and watching him. At one point he stopped in front of her, his voice low. "Do you pray not in the way I used to," she admitted. "But I believe in showing up for people. That's my prayer now." He gave a small nod as if that was enough for him. 5 hours later, a surgeon in blue scrubs appeared at the doorway. Both of them stood immediately, the air in Morgan's lungs catching. "She's stable," the surgeon said. "The procedure went well. She'll be in recovery for a while, but so far, everything looks promising." Morgan felt Daniel's hand close around hers before she even realized he'd reached for it. It wasn't a deliberate gesture, it was instinct, raw and unfiltered. She didn't pull away. When they were finally allowed into the recovery room, Lily was pale but breathing evenly, her small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt like the answer to a question they'd been afraid to ask. Daniel sat at her side, his hand covering hers, while Morgan stood just behind him. "She's gonna be okay," Daniel murmured, as if saying it out loud might make it more true. Morgan reached forward, brushing a stray hair from Lily's forehead. "Told you we'd be here." Over the next few days, recovery became its own slow song. Lily regained color in her cheeks, her voice stronger each morning. Daniel stayed close, rarely leaving the room, and Morgan kept a steady presence, bringing fresh clothes, coaxing both of them to eat, filling the space with quiet conversation when the hours got long. One afternoon, while Lily napped, Daniel turned to her. "When this is over, when she's fully healed, I want to finish that song, not just for her, but for us. For everything that's happened." Morgan met his eyes, a warmth settling in her chest. "Then we'll finish it." They fell into a comfortable quiet, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The beeping of the monitor, the soft hum of hospital machinery, the slow and steady sound of Lily breathing. It all felt like part of the same rhythm. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew that the music they would write next wasn't just about the notes. It was about the way they'd found each other in the spaces between them. The snow had started again by the time Lily was discharged. Flurries swirled in the Boston wind, catching on her knit hat as she stepped out of the hospital for the first time in weeks. Daniel hovered close, one hand steadying her elbow, the other holding a small duffel. Morgan walked on the other side, matching her pace, watching her take in the cold air like it was a gift she'd been waiting for. They weren't going back to New York yet. The doctors wanted her nearby for follow-up appointments, so Morgan had arranged a short-term apartment in a building just a few blocks from the hospital. It wasn't large, but it had wide windows and enough light to make the place feel warmer than the weather outside. That first evening there, Lily insisted they set the keyboard up near the biggest window. "The snow makes the music sound better," she explained, already pulling out the composition sheets. Daniel smiled, a rare one that reached his eyes. "Let's see if you're right." For the next hour, the three of them sat in that sunlit corner, Lily playing slow, careful notes, Daniel guiding her fingers. Morgan leaning against the wall with her coffee humming the melody when Lily faltered. The unfinished song had grown in quiet ways over the weeks, almost without them noticing. It wasn't Chopin's Nocturne anymore. It was something entirely theirs. After Lily went to bed, Morgan lingered in the kitchen, rinsing mugs while Daniel straightened the music sheets. He looked up at her after a moment. "I don't know how to thank you for all this." "You don't have to," she replied, drying her hands. "I didn't do it to be thanked." He hesitated, then said, "Still, you changed everything, for both of us." Morgan's gaze softened. "You changed me too, Daniel. I didn't think I needed anyone. Turns out I was wrong." They stood there for a moment, the only sound the low hum of the radiator. The next morning, Lily's follow-up went well. The cardiologist was pleased with her progress, and for the first time in months, Daniel walked out of a doctor's office with his shoulders relaxed. Morgan caught the look on his face and smiled. Feels different when they give you good news, doesn't it? He chuckled quietly. Like I can finally take a full breath. They celebrated that night with takeout from the small Italian place down the street. Lily ate half her pasta before leaning back and declaring, "When we go home, I want to have a concert. For everyone who helped us." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Everyone." "Everyone," Lily repeated, eyes shining. "We'll play the song. The whole song." Morgan laughed. "I think that's the best idea I've heard in a long time." Over the next week, the apartment filled with more music than conversation. Lily grew stronger each day, her fingers more confident on the keys. Daniel played alongside her sometimes, but Morgan noticed that more often he'd just listen. Really listen, like he was trying to memorize the sound of his daughter's joy. One night, after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel stayed at the piano, running his hands over the keys without pressing them. Morgan joined him, sitting on the bench beside him. "Remember when you told me some things stop belonging to you when you stop needing them to survive?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Maybe she said some things come back when you realize you were never supposed to let them go." Daniel's eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. But neither moved. Neither broke the moment. Instead, he smiled faintly and began to play a soft, tentative run of notes that would grow into the next part of their song. Morgan stayed there listening until the snow outside blurred the edges of the city lights, and the only thing left in the room was the music. By the time spring found its way to Boston, the snow had melted into narrow streams along the sidewalks, and the air carried that first hint of warmth that made people linger outside a little longer. Lily's cheeks had color now, her steps steady, her laughter quick to rise. The follow-up appointments had shifted from tense silences to nods of approval, and with each visit, Daniel seemed to stand taller. It was Lily's idea to hold the concert in the small community hall near the apartment. She'd been talking about it since the night she declared her plan over a plate of pasta, and Daniel, reluctant at first, had finally agreed when she looked at him with those wide, determined eyes. Morgan handled the details, reserving the space, setting up chairs, arranging for a small sound system. She even called the pediatric nurses to make sure they knew they were invited. On the night of the concert, the hall was filled with more people than Daniel had expected. Neighbors from both Boston and New York staff from the hospital, even a few familiar faces from the building where they used to live. The room smelled faintly of coffee and baked goods from a table near the back, where Lily had insisted on setting up snacks for after. Backstage, though, it was really just a corner of the hall, separated by a curtain. Lily sat on a folding chair, her small hands clasped in her lap. She looked up at Daniel. "Do you think they'll like it?" "They'll love it," he said without hesitation, crouching down so they were eye level. "Because it's yours." Morgan appeared with a warm smile. "And ours," she added, holding up the final sheet of music they'd been working on for weeks. When it was time, Lily walked to the piano at the center of the room. The applause that met her was soft but full, the kind of sound that carries warmth more than noise. Daniel sat beside her on the bench, and Morgan stood at a microphone a few feet away, ready to hum the harmony. The first notes were tentative, as if they were testing the air, but soon the melody grew threading through the room with a quiet strength. It wasn't the Chopin piece anymore. It was theirs, a patchwork of late nights hospital rooms, snow-lined sidewalks, and the stubborn kind of hope that refuses to quit. Daniel's hands moved over the keys with a grace he hadn't shown in years, his gaze flicking to Lily every few measures. Morgan's voice slipped in like a ribbon, weaving through the music, lifting it higher without ever overpowering it. People in the audience leaned forward, drawn into something they might not have understood completely, but could feel down to their bones. When the last chord faded, there was a heartbeat of silence before the applause rose loud, sustained, unguarded. Lily's smile was wide enough to light the room on its own. She hopped down from the bench and wrapped her arms around both Daniel and Morgan at once. "We did it," she whispered. Afterward, people milled around, offering hugs and congratulations. A nurse from Lily's surgical team told Daniel she'd never seen a patient bounce back so fast. A neighbor pressed a small bouquet of daffodils into Lily's hands. As the crowd thinned, Daniel found Morgan by the piano, stacking sheet music back into its folder. "You know," he said quietly, "if you hadn't walked into our lives that day in the hallway, none of this would have happened. Morgan looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she said, "And if you hadn't let me in, I'd still be chasing things that never would have filled me." They stood there, the hum of conversation fading as the last of the guests filtered out. Lily was at the snack table happily unwrapping a cookie, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the shape of his life settle into something that felt right. When they stepped outside, the evening air was cool, the sky streaked with the last blush of sunset. Lily walked ahead of them, skipping every few steps, the daffodils bobbing in her hand. Daniel glanced at Morgan, catching her watching his daughter with an expression that was part pride, part tenderness, part something deeper she hadn't yet said out loud. "She's going to be okay," he said more to himself than to her. Morgan's gaze shifted to him. "So are you." They walked in silence for a while, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. And though there were no grand declarations, no promises spoken under the fading light, both of them knew that what they'd built note by note, moment by moment, wasn't something that would end when the music stopped.